Okay. Um, I'm adjusting my position so that I'm actually comfortable. So I'm reading chapter 15. I think I'm reading to at least 320, maybe 322, if I feel like it when I get there. But that's about half the chapter. So, 309, the ferment of reform and culture. Chapter 15 again. A third revolution accompanied the reformation of American politics and the transformation of the American economy in the mid-19th century. It consisted of a diffuse yet deeply felt commitment to improve the character of ordinary Americans, to make them more upstanding, God-fearing, and literate. Some high-minded souls were disillusioned by the rough-and-tumble realities of democratic politics. Others, notably women, were excluded from the political game altogether. As the young republic grew, increasing numbers of Americans poured their considerable energies into an astonishing variety of religious revivals and reform movements. Reform campaigns of all types flourished in sometimes bewildering abundance. There was not a reading man who was without some scheme for a new utopia in his waistcoat pocket, claimed Ralph Waldo Emerson. Reformers promoted better public schools and rights for women, as well as miracle medicines, polygamy, celibacy, rule by prophets, and guidance by spirits. Societies were formed against alcohol, tobacco, profanity, and the transit of mail on the Sabbath. Eventually overshadowing all other reforms was the Great Crusade against slavery. Many reformers drew their crusading zeal from religion. Beginning in late 1790s and boiling over into the 19th century, the Second Great Awakening swept through America's Protestant churches, fundamentally shaping the nation's religious landscape and powerfully reaffirming religion's central role in American society, as a generation of believers embarked on their missions to perfect the world. Reviving religion. Church attendance was still a regular ritual for about 3/4 of the 23 million Americans in 1850. Alex de Tocqueville declared that there was no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. Yet the religion of these years was not the old-time religion of the colonial days. The austere Calvinist rigor had long been seeping out of the American churches. The rationalist ideas of the French Revolutionary era had done much to soften the older orthodoxy. Thomas Paine's widely circulated book, The Age of Reason, had shockingly declared that all churches were set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. American anti-clericalism was seldom and virulent, but many of the founding fathers, including Jefferson and Franklin, embraced the liberal doctrines of deism that Paine promoted. Deists relied on reason rather than revelation, and on science rather than the Bible. They rejected the concept of original sin and denied Christ's divinity. Yet deists believe in the supreme being who had created a knowable universe and endowed human beings with a capacity for moral behavior. The comforting teachings of deism evolved from a long trend in American religious history. Since Puritan times, American Protestants had grappled mightily with the relationship between free will and human salvation. For the great many affected by Calvinism, the doctrines of predestination and human depravity had always been thorny, even gloomy. More than a century of theological wrangling had moved Protestants of various stripes towards a view of humanity that stressed the essential goodness of human nature rather than its vileness, that emphasized the possibility of salvation through good works, and that pictured God not as a stern creator but as a loving father. During the 18th century, such settlements had flourished most among America's newer denominations, Methodist, Baptist, and Unitarian, but they also made inroads into the older and more rigidly honed pulpits and pews of the Puritan churches, Presbyterian and Congregationalist. This ferment propelled a wave of roaring revivals during the early decades of the 19th century, sweeping up even more people than the first Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was one of the most momentous episodes in the history of American religion. This tidal wave of spiritual fervor left in its wake countless converted souls, many shattered and reorganized churches, and numerous new sects. It also encouraged an effervescent evangelicalism that bubbled up into innumerable areas of American life, including prison reform, the temperance cause, the women's movement, and the crusade to abolish slavery. The Second Great Awakening was spread to the masses by huge camp meetings. As many as 25,000 people would gather for an encampment of several days to drink the frothy gospel as served up by an itinerant preacher. Thousands of spiritually starved souls got religion at these gatherings. In their ecstasy, they engaged in the frenzies of rolling, dancing, barking, and jerking. Many of the saved soon backslid into their former sinful ways, but the revivals boosted church membership and further buttressed the nation's religious core. Countless Americans heeded God's call. They joined reform-minded, benevolent societies and carried their missionary creed to Africa, Asia, Hawaii, and to the Indian tribes of the American West. Methodists and Baptists reaped the most abundant harvests of souls from the fields fertilized by revivalism. Both sects stressed personal conversion, contrary to predestination, a relatively democratic control of church affairs, and a rousing emotionalism. A frontier jingle ran, "The devil hates the Methodists because they sing and shout the best." Powerful Peter Cartwright was the best known of the Methodist circuit riders, or traveling frontier preachers. This ill-educated but sinewy servant of the Lord ranged for a half-century from Tennessee to Illinois, calling upon sinners to repent. With bellowing voice and flailing arms, he converted thousands of souls to the Lord. Not only did he lash the devil with his tongue, but with his fists he knocked out rowdies who tried to break up his meetings. His Christianity was definitely muscular. Bell-voiced Charles Grandison Finney was the greatest of the revival preachers. Trained as a lawyer, Finney abandoned the bar to become an evangelist after a deeply moving conversion experience as a young man. Tall and athletically built, Finney... Excuse me, that was a hiccup. Finney held huge crowds spellbound with the power of his oratory and the pungency of his message. He led massive revivals in Rochester and New York City in 1830 and 1831. Finney preached a version of the old-time religion, but he was also an innovator. He devised the anxious bench where repentant sinners could sit in full view of the congregation, and he encouraged women to pray aloud in public. Holding out the promise of a perfect Christian kingdom on earth, Finney denounced both alcohol and slavery. He eventually served as president of Oberlin College in Ohio, which he helped to make a hotbed of revivalist activity and abolitionism. A key feature of the Second Great Awakening was the feminization of religion in terms of both church membership and theology. Middle-class women, the wives and daughters of businessmen, were the first and most fervent enthusiasts of religious revivalism. They made up the majority of new church members, and they were most likely to stay within the fold with the tent. Oh, I dropped my microphone. My little earbud. Okay. They made up the majority of new church members, and they were most likely to stay within the fold when the tents were packed up and traveling evangelists left town. Perhaps women's greater ambivalence than men about changes wrought by the expanding market economy made them such eager converts to piety. It helped them as well that evangelicals preached a gospel of female spiritual worth and offered women an active role in bringing their husbands and families back to God. That accomplished, many women turned to saving the rest of society. They formed a host of benevolent and charitable organizations and spearheaded crusades for most, if not all, of the era's ambitious reforms. Whew. Denominational diversity. Revivals also furthered the fragmentation of religious faiths. Western New York, where many descendants of New England Puritans had settled, was so blistered by sermonizers preaching hellfire and damnation that it became known as a burned-over district. Millerites, or Adventists, who'd mustered several 100,000 adherents, rose from superheated soil of the burned-over district in the 1830s. Named after the eloquent and commanding William Miller, they interpreted the Bible to mean that Christ would return to earth on October 22, 1844. Donning their go-to meeting clothes, they gathered in prayerful assemblies to greet their Redeemer. The failure of Jesus to descend on schedule dampened, but did not destroy the movement. Like the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening tended to widen the lines between classes and religions. The more prosperous and conservative denominations in the East were somewhat less shaken by revivalism. Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Unitarians continued to rise mostly from the wealthier, urbanized, better educated levels of society. Methodists, Baptists, and the members of the other new sects spawned by the swelling evangelistic fervor tended to come from less prosperous, less learned communities in the rural South and West. Religious diversity further reflected social cleavages when the churches faced up to the slavery issue. By 1844 to 1845, both the Southern Baptists and the Southern Methodists had split with their northern brethren over human bondage. The Methodists came to grief over the case of slave-owning bishop in Georgia, whose second wife added several household slaves to his estate. In 1857, the Presbyterians, North and South, parted company. The secession of the Southern churches foreshadowed the secession of the Southern states. First, the churches split, then the political parties split, and then the Union split. A desert Zion in Utah. The smoldering spiritual embers of the burned-over district kindled one especially ardent flame in 1830. In that year, Joseph Smith, the Mormon, a rugged visionary, proud of his prowess at wrestling, reported that he had received some golden plates from an angel. When he deciphered, they constituted the Book of Mormon, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, was launched. It was a Native American product, a new religion destined to spread its influence worldwide. After establishing a religious oligarchy, Smith ran into serious opposition from his non-Mormon neighbors, first in Ohio and then in Missouri and Illinois. His cooperative sect antagonized rank-and-file Americans who were individualistic and dedicated to free enterprise. The Mormons aroused further anger by voting as a unit and by openly, understandably, drilling their militia for defensive purposes. Accusations of polygamy likewise arose and increased in intensity, for Joseph Smith was reputed to have several wives. Continuing hostility finally drove the Mormons to desperate measures. In 1844, Joseph Smith and his brother were murdered and mangled by a mob in Carthage, Illinois, and the movement seemed near collapse. The falling torch was seized by a remarkable Mormon, Moses, named Brigham Young. Stern and austere in contrast to Smith's charm and affability, the barrel-chested Brigham Young had received only 11 days of formal schooling, but he quickly proved to be an aggressive leader, an eloquent preacher, and a gifted administrator. Determined to escape further persecution, Young, in 1846 to 1847, led his oppressed and despoiled Latter-day Saints over vast rolling plains to Utah, as they sang, "Come, come, ye saints." Overcoming pioneer hardships, the Mormons soon made the desert bloom like a new Eden by means of ingenious and cooperative methods of irrigation. The crops of 1848, threatened by hordes of crickets, were saved when flocks of gulls appeared, as if by a miracle, to gulp down the invaders. A monument to the seagulls stands in Salt Lake City today. Semi-arid Utah grew remarkably. By the end of 1848, some 5,000 settlers had arrived, and other large bands were to follow them. Many dedicated Mormons in the 1850s actually made the 1,300-mile trek across plains, pulling two-wheeled carts. Under the rigidly disciplined management of Brigham Young, the community became a prosperous frontier theocracy and a cooperative commonwealth. Young married as many as 27 women, some of them wives in name only, and begot 56 children. The population was further swelled by thousands of immigrants from Europe, where the Mormons had established a flourishing missionary movement. A crisis developed when the Washington government was unable to control the hierarchy of Brigham Young, who had been made territorial governor in 1850. A federal army marched in 1857 against the Mormons, who harassed its lines of supply and rallied to die in their last dusty ditch. Fortunately, the quarrel was finally adjusted without serious bloodshed. The Mormons later ran afoul of anti-polygamy laws passed by Congress in 1862 and 1882, and their unique marital customs delayed statehood for Utah until 1896. Free schools for a free people. Okay. Tax-supported primary schools were scarce in the early years of the Republic. They had the odor of pauperism about them because they existed chiefly to educate the children of the poor, the so-called ragged schools. Advocates of free public education met stiff opposition. A Midwestern legislator cried that he only wanted the simple epitaph when he died, "Here lies an enemy of public education." Well-to-do, conservative Americans gradually saw the light. If they did not pay to educate other folks' brats, the brats might grow up into a dangerous, ignorant rabble armed with the vote. Taxation for education was an insurance premium that the wealthy paid for stability and democracy. Tax-supported public education, though miserably lagging in the slavery-cursed South, triumphed between 1825 and 1850. Hard-toiling laborers wielded increased influence and demanded instruction for their children. Most important was the gaining of manhood suffrage for whites in Jackson's day. A free vote cried aloud for free education. A civilized nation that was both ignorant and free, declared Thomas Jefferson, never was and never will be. The famed Little Red Schoolhouse, with 1 room, 1 stove, 1 teacher, and often 8 grades, became the shrine of American democracy. Regrettably, it was an imperfect shrine. Early free schools stayed open only a few months of the year. School teachers, most of them men in this era, were too often ill-trained, ill-tempered, and ill-paid. They frequently put more stress on lickin', with a hickory stick, than on larnin'. These knights of the blackboard often boarded around in the community, and some knew scarcely more than their older pupils. They usually taught only the 3 R's, readin', writin', and arithmetic. To many rugged Americans, suspicious of book larnin' this was enough. They're writing in Sorry. Reform was urgently needed. Into the breach stepped Horace Mann, a brilliant and idealistic graduate of Brown University. As secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, he campaigned effectively for more and better schoolhouses, longer school terms, higher pay for teachers, and an expanded curriculum. His influence radiated out to other states, and impressive improvements were chalked up. Yet education remained an expensive luxury for many communities. As late as 1860, the nation counted only about 100 public secondary schools and nearly 1 million white adult illiterates. Black slaves in the South were legally forbidden to receive instruction in reading or writing, and even free blacks in the North as well as the South were usually excluded from the schools. Educational advances were aided by improved textbooks, notably those of Noah Webster, a Yale-educated Connecticut Yankee who was known as the schoolmaster of the Republic. His reading lessons, used by millions of children in the 19th century, were partly designed to promote patriotism. Webster devoted 20 years to his famous dictionary, published in 1828, which helped to standardize the American language. Equally influential was Ohioan William H. McGuffery, a teacher-preacher of rare power. His grade school readers, first published in the 1830s, sold 122 million copies in the following decades. McGuffey's readers hammered home lasting lessons in morality, patriotism, and idealism. Higher goals for higher learning. Higher education was likewise stirring. The religious zeal of the Second Great Awakening led to the planting of many small denominational liberal arts colleges, chiefly in the South and West. Too often they were academically anemic, established more to satisfy local pride than genuinely to advance the cause of learning. Like their more venerable ivy-draped brethren, the new colleges offered a narrow, tradition-bound curriculum of Latin, Greek, mathematics, and moral philosophy. On new and old campuses alike, there was little intellectual vitality and much boredom. The first state-supported universities sprang up in the South, beginning with North Carolina in 1795. Federal land grants nourished the growth of state institutions of higher learning. Conspicuous among their early group was the University of Virginia, founded in 1819. It was largely the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson, who designed its beautiful architecture and who at times watched its construction through a telescope from his hilltop home. He dedicated the university to freedom from religious or political shackles, and modern languages and the sciences received unusual emphasis. Women's higher education was frowned upon in the early decades of the 19th century. A woman's place was believed to be in the home, and training in needlecraft seemed more important than training in algebra. In an era when the clinging vine bride was the ideal, coeducation was regarded as frivolous. Prejudices also prevailed that too much learning injured the feminine brain, undermined health, and rendered a young lady unfit for marriage. The teachers of Susan B. Anthony, the future feminist, refused to instruct her in long division. Women's schools at the secondary level began to attain some respectability in the 1820s, thanks in part to the dedicated work of Emma Willard. In 1821, she established the Troy, New York, Female Seminary. Oberlin College in Ohio jolted traditionalists in 1837 when it opened its doors to women as well as men. Oberlin had already created shockwaves by admitting black students. In the same year, Mary Lyon established an astounding women's school, Mount Holyoke Seminary, later college, in South Hadley, Massachusetts. Mossback critics scoffed that they'll be educating cows next. Adults who craved more learning satisfied their thirst for knowledge at private subscription libraries, or, increasingly, at tax-supported libraries. House-to-house peddlers also did a lush business in feeding the public appetite for culture. Sorry, I was reading ahead. Traveling lecturers helped carry... Oh, where was I? I lost my place. Helped to carry learning to the masses through the Lyceum lecture associations, which numbered about 3,000 by 1835. The Lyceums provided platforms for speakers in such areas as science, literature, and moral philosophy. Talented talkers like Ralph Waldo Emerson journeyed thousands of miles on the Lyceum circuits, casting their pearls of civilization before appreciative audiences. Magazines flourished in the pre-Civil War years, but most of them withered after a short life. The North American Review, founded in 1815, was the long-lived leader of the intellectuals. Godey's Lady's Book, founded in 1830, survived until 1898 and attained the enormous circulation, for those days, of 150,000. It was devoured devotedly by millions of women, many of whom read the dog-eared copies of their relatives and friends. An age of reform. As the young republic grew, reform campaigns of all types flourished in sometimes bewildering abundance as the driving forces of religious revival and the rapid growth of a market economy converged. Some reformers were simply crack-brained cranks, but most were intelligent, inspired idealists, usually touched by the fire of evangelical religion, then licking through the sanctuaries and steeples of American churches. The optimistic promises of the Second Great Awakening inspired countless souls to do battle against earthly evils. These modern idealists dreamed anew the old Puritan vision of a perfected society, free from cruelty, war, intoxicating drink, discrimination, and, ultimately, slavery. Women were particularly prominent in these reform crusades, especially in their own struggle for suffrage. For many middle-class women, the reform campaigns provided a unique opportunity to escape the confines of the home and enter the arena of public affairs. Imprisonment for debt continued to be a nightmare, though its extent had been exaggerated. As late as 1830, hundreds of penniless people were languishing in the filthy holes, sometimes for owing less than $1. The poorer working classes were especially hard hit by this merciless practice, but as the embattled laborer won the ballot and asserted himself, state legislators gradually abolished debtors' prisons. Reformers likewise tackled noxious criminal codes in the United States. criminal codes in the states in accord with more enlightened European practices. They succeeded in reducing the number of capital offenses and helped eliminate brutal punishments such as whipping and branding. A refreshing idea was taking hold that prison should reform as well as punish, hence reformatories, houses of correction, and penitentiaries for penance. Sufferers of so-called insanity were still being treated with incredible cruelty. The medieval concept had been that the mentally deranged were cursed with unclean spirits. The 19th century idea was that they were willfully perverse and depraved, to be treated only as beasts. Many crazed persons were chained in jails or poorhouses with sane people. Into this dismal picture stepped a formidable New England teacher author, Dorothea Dix. A physically frail woman afflicted with persistent lung trouble, she possessed infinite compassion and willpower. She traveled some 60,000 miles in 8 years and assembled her damning reports on insanity and asylums from first-hand observations. Though she never raised her voice, Dix's message was loud and clear. Her classic petition of 1843 to the Massachusetts legislature, describing cells so foul that visitors were driven back by the stench, turned legislative stomachs and hearts. Her persistent prodding resulted in improved conditions and a gain for the concept that the demented were not willfully perverse, but mentally ill. Agitation for peace also gained momentum in the pre-Civil War years. In 1828, the American Peace Society was formed, with a ringing declaration of war on war. A leading spirit was William Ladd, who orated when his legs were so badly ulcerated that he had to sit on a stool. His ideas were finally to bear some fruit in the international organizations for collective security of the 20th century. The American Peace Crusade, linked with the European counterpart, was making promising progress by mid-century, but it was set back by the bloodshed of the Crimean War in Europe and the Civil War in America. The demon rum old deluder. The ever-present drink problem attracted dedicated reformers. Custom, combined with a hard and monotonous life, led to the excessive drinking of hard liquor, even among women, clergymen, and members of Congress. Weddings and funerals all too often became disgraceful brawls, and occasionally a drunken mourner would fall into the open grave with the corpse. Heavy drinking decreased the efficiency of labor, and poorly safeguarded machinery operated under the influence of alcohol increased the danger of accidents occurring at work. Drunkenness also fouled the sanctity of the family, threatening the spiritual welfare and physical safety of women and children. After earlier and feebler efforts, the American Temperance Society was formed in Boston in 1826. Within a few years, about 1,000 local groups sprang into existence. They implored drinkers to sign the Temperance Pledge and organized children's clubs, known as the Cold Water Army. Temperance crusaders also made effective use of pictures, pamphlets, and lurid lecturers, some of whom were reformed drunkards. A popular temperance song rang, "We've done with our days of caressing, our nights too of frolicsome glee, for now with our sober minds choosing, we've pledged ourselves never to spree." Excuse me. The most popular anti-alcohol tract of the era was T.S. Arthur's melodramatic novel, 10 Nights in a Barroom and What I Saw There. It described in shocking detail how a once happy village was ruined by Sam Slade's tavern. The book was second only to Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin as a bestseller in the 1850s, and it enjoyed a highly successful run on the stage. Its touching theme song began with the words of a little girl, "Father, dear father, come home with me now, the clock in Belfry strikes 1." Terrible rhyme scheme. Early foes of demon drink adopted two major lines of attack. One was to stiffen the individual's will to resist the wiles of the little brown jug. The moderate reformers thus stressed temperance rather than teetotalism, or the total elimination of intoxicants. But less patient zealots came to believe that the temptation should be removed by legislation. Prominent among this group was Neil S. Dow of Maine, a blue-nosed reformer who, as a mayor of Portland and an employer of labor, had often witnessed the debauching effect of alcohol, to say nothing of the cost to his pocketbook of work time lost because of drunken employees. Dow, the father of Prohibition, sponsored the so-called Maine Law of 1851. This drastic new state statute, hailed as the Law of Heaven Americanized, prohibited the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquor. Other states in the North followed Maine's example, and by 1857 about a dozen had passed various prohibitory laws. But these figures are deceptive, for within a decade some of the statutes were repealed or declared unconstitutional, if not openly flouted. It was clearly impossible to legislate thirst for alcohol out of existence, especially in localities where public sentiment was hostile. Yet on the eve of the Civil War, the prohibitionists had registered an inspiring gains. There was much less drinking among women than earlier in the century, and probably much less per capita consumption of hard liquor. Okay. Women in revolt. Yes. When the 19th century opened, it was still a man's world, both in America and in Europe. A wife was supposed to immerse herself in her home and subordinate herself to her lord and master, her husband. Like black slaves, she could not vote. Like black slaves, she could be legally beaten by her overlord with a reasonable instrument. When she married, she could not retain title to her property. It passed to her husband. Yet American women, though legally regarded as perpetual minors, fared better than their European cousins. French visitor Alexis de Tocqueville noted that in his native France, rape was punished only lightly, whereas in America it was one of the few crimes punishable by death. Despite these relative advantages, women were still the submerged sex in America in the early part of the century, but as the decades unfolded, women increasingly surfaced to breathe the air of freedom and self-determination. In contrast to women in colonial times, many women now avoided marriage altogether. About 10% of adult women remained spinsters at the time of the Civil War. Gender differences were strongly emphasized in 19th century America, largely because the burgeoning market economy was increasingly separating women and men into sharply distinct economic roles. Women were thought to be physically and emotionally weak, but also artistic and refined. Endowed with finely tuned moral sensibilities, they were the keepers of society's conscience, with special responsibility to teach the young how to be good and productive citizens of the Republic. Men were considered strong but crude, always in danger of slipping into some savage or beastly way of life if not guided by the gentle hands of their loving ladies. The home was a women's special sphere, the centerpiece of the cult of domesticity. Even reformers like Catherine Beecher, who urged her sisters to seek employment as teachers, endlessly celebrated the role of the good homemaker. But some women increasingly felt that the glorified sanctuary of the home was in fact a gilded cage. They yearned to tear down the bars that separated the private world of women from the public world of men. Clamorous female reformers, most of them white and well-to-do, began to gather strength as the century neared its halfway point. Most were broad-gauge battlers. While demanding rights for women, they joined in the general reform movement of the age, fighting for temperance and the abolition of slavery. Like men, they had been touched by the evangelical spirit that offered the promise of earthly reward for human endeavor. Neither foul eggs nor foul words, when hurled by disapproving men, could halt women heartened by these doctrines. The women's rights movements were mothered by some arresting characters. Prominent among them was Lucretia Mott, a sprightly Quaker whose ire had been aroused when she and her fellow female delegates to the London Anti-Slavery Convention of 1840 were not recognized. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a mother of 7 who had insisted on leaving Obey out of her marriage ceremony, shocked by fellow feminists by going so far as to advocate suffrage for women. Quaker reared Susan B. Anthony, a militant lecturer for women's rights, fearlessly exposed herself to rotten garbage and vulgar epithets. She became such a conspicuous advocate of female rights that progressive women everywhere called her Susie B's. Were called Susie B's. Other feminists challenged the man's world. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, a pioneer in a previously forbidden profession for women, was the first female graduate of a medical college. The talented Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, championed anti-slavery. Lucy Stone retained her maiden name after marriage, hence the latter-day Lucy Stoners, who follow her example. Amelia Bloomer revolted against the current street-sweeping female attire by donning a short skirt with Turkish trousers, bloomers, they were called, amid much bawdy ridicule about bloomerism and loose habits. A jeering male rhyme of times jabbed. Gibby gibby gab, the woman had a confab, and demanded the rights to wear the tights, gibby gibby gab. Unflinching feminists met in 1848 in a memorable women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York. The defiant Stanton read a Declaration of Sentiments, which in the spirit of Declaration of Independence declared that all men and women are created equal. One resolution formally demanded the ballot for females. Oop, my mic is falling. Amid scorn and denunciation from press and pulpit, the Seneca Falls meeting launched the modern women's rights movement. The crusade for women's rights was eclipsed by the campaign against slavery in the decade before the Civil War. Still, any white male, even an idiot, over the age of 21 could vote, while no woman could. Yet women were gradually being admitted to colleges, and some states, beginning with Mississippi in 1839, were even permitting wives to own property after marriage. Whew! Okay, I think that's all I can read now, because I got to go. Okay, yay!